Welcome back to Investment Systems Engineering, a series inside of the Winners United podcast. We ask one practical question, and that is, what can engineers teach us about building investment systems that hold up when the world gets messy? So far, we've talked about single points of failure. We've talked about redundancy. We've also talked about feedback loops and stress testing. And then we discussed margin of safety and failure modes. Different topics, same goal. And that goal is to make better decisions in a reality that refuses to stay perfectly predictable. But there's another problem that only gets more serious as systems get more complex. You see, it's not that you don't have enough information. It's that you have way too much of it. Think about what it feels like to evaluate an investment today. You can pull up interest rates, inflation data, employment numbers, housing reports, and do all of this long-term research and confident opinions from people you followed from years. It all arrives at once, and it creates a simple but frustrating question. How do you know what's actually important? Because information isn't the same thing as insight, and being exposed to more data doesn't automatically make your decisions better. Engineers have a clean name for this: signal versus noise. And that's our focus today. Let's define it in a way that's easy to feel. Imagine you're in a crowded airport. There are conversations everywhere. Wheels rolling across the floor, engines outside, announcements echoing, phones ringing. That's all information, but you're really listening for only one thing: your boarding call. That's the signal. Everything else might be real, and it might even be accurate, but it's just not relevant to the decision that you're trying to make. And that's noise. And that distinction matters because noise doesn't have to mean false. A lot of noise is actually true. It's just not decision useful. You see, engineers run into this constantly. Sensors produce readings that wiggle up and down, and systems generate endless measurements. Networks and machines, they create streams of events. But not every fluctuation means something meaningful has changed. A temperature reading, for instance, it shifts by a fraction of a degree. Is that a real warning? Or is it a normal variation? Or the first hint of a problem forming? The engineer's job isn't to collect everything, in other words. It's to interpret what it means and then decide whether it calls for action. That's a very different skill than simply staying informed. Now, take that idea and scale it up. Think about radar. A radar system operates in an environment full of junk signals. You've got weather patterns, birds, terrain reflections, other aircraft, atmospheric interference, even electronic interference. And if the system treated every single blip like it mattered, it would become unusable. It would constantly scream for attention until the operator couldn't tell what deserved their focus. So radar has to filter and prioritize. It's not ignoring reality. Instead, it's ranking reality by relevance. And the same problem shows up in modern manufacturing. A production line might have thousands of sensors tracking temperature, pressure, vibration, alignment, speed, tolerance, electrical characteristics, and a whole lot more. But the point isn't to overwhelm a person with a wall of numbers. The point is to identify a handful of measurements that actually indicate the system is drifting into trouble. That's the signal detection. Here's the paradox. As systems get more sophisticated, filtering becomes more important, not less. You see, complexity creates more potential signals, but it produces even more noise along the way. Software is a perfect example. You have big applications that generate millions of events, logs, warnings, errors, transactions, network behavior, user activity, and most of them are not even emergencies. If every event triggers an alarm, the alarm system collapses. People get numb. They stop responding. That's called alert fatigue. Again, the problem isn't a lack of information. It's failing to separate what matters from what merely happens. So, what does this mean for investing? Well, I'd argue that this is one of the most underappreciated challenges that investors face right now. We have more access to financial information than any generation before us, and yet that doesn't automatically translate into better judgment. Sometimes it does the exact opposite. You see, too many inputs can actually push you into constant reaction mode, even when your underlying investment has not meaningfully changed. Let's make it concrete. Suppose you own an investment property. This week, you see headlines about rates, the stock market, Fed policy, housing starts, oil prices, consumer confidence, political developments, and two analysts fighting in public. One is predicting a real estate crash, and the other is declaring a golden age for housing. Which one matters? Well, the honest answer is it depends. It depends on the question you're trying to answer. You see, if the decision in front of you is, will this specific investment keep producing its contractual cash flow, then a lot of headlines suddenly become low-value inputs. You probably care more about the things closest to the system itself. Those things being actual payment performance or debt service coverage, maybe occupancy, operating expenses, borrower behavior, collateral value, liquidity, and whether the core assumptions behind the investment are still intact. Now, those items are much more likely to be your signals. Much of the rest may be context, but it may not deserve top billing. This also connects to something we discussed earlier in the series, and that is feedback loops. A feedback loop needs the right measurement. You need a signal, a threshold that tells you something has changed enough to matter, and then a defined response. Without that, you're not building a feedback loop. You're just collecting information and hoping that wisdom appears. Here's another scenario. Imagine an investment is performing exactly as expected. Cash flow is arriving, obligations are being met, and the underlying asset still looks healthy. But markets are volatile, headlines are noisy, and everyone sounds anxious. Should you automatically change your investment because the environment feels unstable? Well, not necessarily. You see, volatility can be real and the news may be accurate, but you still have to ask the engineering question, and that is this a signal that the underlying investment system has deteriorated? A market event isn't automatically an investment signal. You have to understand the transmission mechanism. How does this specific event reach your specific system? And what channel does it travel through? And what variable does it actually change? If you can't explain the connection, then there's a good chance you're reacting to noise. Now, there's a second side to this that might be even more dangerous, and that is false signals. A false signal tells you something important is happening when it actually isn't. A smoke detector is a good mental model. You want it to detect smoke, obviously, but you don't want it to call the fire department every time someone burns toast. If a detector is too sensitive, you end up with constant false alarms, and people start ignoring it. If it isn't sensitive enough, it may miss a real fire. Engineering is often about balancing those two error types. Too many false positives versus too many missed detections. So investing has the same trade-off. Picture an investor who reacts every time markets swing 5%. One week it's inflation panic. The next week it's rate panic. Then jobs, then geopolitics, then housing, and then there's something else. It feels like vigilance, but it may actually be self-inflicting instability. They're teaching their own system to jerk the steering wheel every single time the road gets bumpy. And that isn't resilience. That's reactivity. And the opposite risk is just as real. An investor can become so attached to a thesis that they label every warning sign as noise. The system becomes insensitive and it stops responding to information that should trigger investigation. That's called confirmation bias, but expressed as a system design flaw. This is where an engineering mindset helps, because it shifts the question. Instead of asking, "Do I agree with this information?" ask, "If this were true, what would it imply for my system?" That question is calmer, that question is more disciplined, and it's much more useful. So, how do you put this into practice? Well, here's a simple framework you can use starting today. Think of it as a signal hierarchy built around 4 questions. The first question is, what decision am I trying to make? You can't identify a meaningful signal until you know what you're deciding. Second question, which variables actually drive that decision? You see, not everything deserves equal attention. Identify the true drivers and not the most talked about topics. And thirdly, what change would cause me to reconsider my assumptions? This one is critical. You should define it before you're in the middle of a headline storm, because if you wait until the information arrives, you'll be tempted to reinterpret everything to match how you already feel. Fourth question, what action would this signal trigger? This might be the most underrated step. because information without a decision rule easily becomes noise. If a signal comes in and you have no idea what you do about it, then what are you really monitoring it for? Put that framework into an example. Let's suppose a particular investment depends on maintaining a certain level of cash flow. A practical signal could be cash flow drops below a preset threshold. Now, that's measurable, it's directly relevant, and it can trigger a response. That response may be investigate the cause, decide whether it's temporary or structural, reassess the assumptions, and determine whether intervention is needed. That's a feedback system. And then compare that with something like, I read a negative article about the economy. That might be interesting, and it might even be well researched. But unless you can tie it to your system through a clear mechanism, it's probably not a signal. It's just noise that feels meaningful because it's loud. The deeper lesson here goes beyond investing. And that lesson is attention is limited. You cannot give equal weight to everything, and any system that tries will eventually degrade. Resilient systems, they set priorities. They define what matters, they establish thresholds, and then they decide on responses and keep irrelevant information from overwhelming the people responsible for those decisions. That's why good engineers don't chase more data. They want better measurements, better sensors, better thresholds, better models, better feedback, and clearer decision rules. The real goal isn't to maximize how much you can collect. It's to maximize how much your decisions improve. So, here's your engineering challenge for the week. Pick one investment you're actively evaluating. Write down the information you routinely consume about it. News, reports, market data, commentary, forecasts. Then ask yourself, which 3 or 4 variables would genuinely make me change my decision? Those are your signals. Everything else might still be context, but it doesn't deserve the same level of attention. And then ask one last question. Am I monitoring the system, or am I just watching the noise around the system? Because in a world overflowing with inputs, knowing what to ignore can be just as valuable as knowing what to learn. The strongest systems don't react to everything. They identify what matters, they measure it, they set thresholds, and they respond when those thresholds are crossed. That's the difference between being informed and making better decisions. When the financial world gets loud, take a step back. Don't only ask what's happening. Instead, ask, does any of this change what actually matters to my system? And remember, we don't predict the future. We engineer it. I'm Andrew Adams, and this has been Investment Systems Engineering.